The council chamber floated in the void of space like a massive crystal sphere, reflecting the light of distant stars across its surface in patterns that shifted and changed with every passing moment. Inside the chamber, representatives from 73 different species sat in their designated areas, each section designed to accommodate the unique biological needs of its occupants. Some breathed methane, others required intense heat, and a few existed partially in dimensions that most species could barely perceive. The air was thick with tension that even the advanced translation systems seemed to struggle with, creating small delays and awkward pauses as anger and fear mixed together in multiple languages at once. Jake Sullivan stood in the center of the chamber on a platform that slowly rotated to face each section of representatives in turn. He wore the simple gray uniform of Earth's diplomatic corps, with nothing more than a small blue and green patch showing his home planet on his shoulder. His hands were clasped behind his back in a posture that he hoped conveyed confidence, even though his heart was racing faster than he wanted to admit. Around him, the voices of the council members rose and fell, like waves crashing against rocks, each one demanding something different, each one more hostile than the last. The Valorian representative, a massive creature covered in dark purple scales with 4 arms and eyes that glowed like hot coals, stood from his seat with movements that made the entire section shake. War Master Thexnal was known throughout the galaxy as a commander who had never lost a battle, who had crushed 17 different rebellions, and who considered mercy to be a weakness that only inferior species possessed. His voice boomed through the chamber, with a sound like grinding metal mixed with distant thunder. He spoke of humanity as if they were insects that had somehow learned to use tools, a temporary problem that required a permanent solution. Jake waited for the translation to finish before he responded, keeping his voice calm and measured even though every instinct told him to run or fight or do anything except stand here and listen to threats of genocide delivered with bureaucratic politeness. He explained that humanity had only settled on worlds that were uninhabited, that they had followed every guideline provided to new species, that they had asked for nothing more than the same rights and freedoms that every other member of the galactic community enjoyed. His words sounded reasonable to his own ears, but he could see in the faces around him that reason had left this chamber long before he arrived. The council leader, an ancient being called Zex Thor, who resembled a floating collection of geometric shapes that constantly rearranged themselves, spoke with a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The decision had been made before this meeting ever took place. Humanity had 3 standard cycles, roughly equivalent to 6 Earth months, to withdraw from all contested systems and accept permanent restrictions on their expansion. The alternative was simple and brutal. The Council would authorize the Valorian Empire to solve the human problem with whatever methods they deemed necessary. Jake knew what that meant because the galaxy had seen it before. The Valorians did not take prisoners, and they did not believe in proportional responses. When they were sent to solve a problem, they erased it completely and absolutely. He tried one more time to appeal to the other species, to find anyone who might speak on humanity's behalf. But the silence that followed his words was more damning than any accusation. The other species either supported the Valorians or were too afraid to oppose them. The platform lowered back to the floor, and Jake was escorted from the chamber by guards who kept their weapons visible but not quite pointed at him. He returned to his small ship and immediately tried to send a message to Earth. But the communication channels were already being jammed by Valorian military frequencies. He switched to an emergency backup system that was slower and less secure but at least functional. The message was brief because he knew they would cut him off soon. They are coming, and God help us all. The journey back to Earth took 3 weeks, and during that time Jake watched as the Valorian Empire began mobilizing the largest military fleet that anyone in the current galactic civilization had ever assembled. Long-range sensors picked up ships gathering at designated coordinates, coming from every corner of Valorian space to form an armada that numbered in the thousands. Each ship was a city-sized fortress bristling with weapons that could crack planets and shields that had never been penetrated in recorded history. Intelligence reports estimated over 10,000 vessels in total, with more joining every day. On Earth, President Helen Cross received Jake's message in the middle of the night and immediately called an emergency cabinet meeting. By sunrise, every major government and military leader was gathered in the Situation Room deep beneath the capital. The walls were covered with tactical displays, showing the Valorian fleet's position and projected attack routes. Every simulation ran ended the same way, with humanity being wiped from existence in a matter of days or weeks at most. Admiral Greg Hayes stood before the assembled leaders and delivered his assessment with the kind of brutal honesty that made him respected even by those who hated his conclusions. Earth's defense fleet consisted of 200 ships built over the last 30 years since humanity had first developed faster than light travel. They were good ships with brave crews and decent weapons, but they were designed to fight pirates and patrol trade routes, not to face a galactic superpower. Against the Valorian armada, they would last perhaps an hour before being completely destroyed. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the soft humming of the tactical displays and the sound of people trying not to panic. President Cross looked around at the faces of her advisors and military commanders, seeing her own fear reflected back at her. Then, Dr. Lisa Bennett from Naval Intelligence spoke up with a quiet voice that somehow cut through the despair. She was a small woman, with gray hair, pulled back in a tight bun, and glasses that she kept adjusting nervously. "There might be one option," she said, though her tone suggested she was not entirely certain it qualified as hope. Project Nightfall had been classified above top secret for 2 decades. Most of the people in the room had never heard of it. Those who had were sworn to secrecy on pain of treason charges. Dr. Bennett explained that 20 years ago, humanity had discovered something at the edge of the solar system. Something that had changed everything. She pulled up files that made even the president's security clearance seem inadequate. Images filled the screens, showing a ship that dwarfed anything humanity had ever built, ancient beyond measure and clearly designed for only one purpose. The ship belonged to a species called the Architects, who had vanished from the galaxy millions of years before the current civilizations had even evolved. The technology was so far beyond anything the Valorians possessed that comparing them was like comparing a wooden club to a nuclear weapon. Earth's government had made a decision back then to keep the discovery secret and to spend every available resource on restoring the vessel. It had taken 20 years, countless setbacks, and the work of thousands of people who lived and died, never knowing if their efforts would matter. Admiral Hayes pulled up another file showing a man in a captain's uniform with hard eyes and a face that had seen too much combat. Captain Ryan Carter commanded the vessel they had named the USS Vanguard. His crew of 3,000 had trained in complete isolation, learning to operate technology they barely understood, preparing for a day they hoped would never come. President Cross looked at the faces around her and saw the same question in all of them. She asked it anyway because someone had to. Was the Vanguard ready? And could it really stand against an entire armada? Dr. Bennett adjusted her glasses again and gave the only answer she could. They were about to find out, because they had no other choice. The Valorian fleet would reach Earth in less than 2 months, and humanity's survival now depended on an ancient weapon and the desperate hope that they had learned enough to use it properly. 20 years earlier, the Deep Space Monitoring Station at the edge of the solar system had picked up an anomaly that should not have existed according to everything humanity knew about physics and astronomy. The object was massive and moving very slowly in a trajectory that suggested it had been drifting for an impossibly long time. Dr. Claire Morgan was the first scientist to review the data, and she immediately knew that this was not a natural phenomenon, because nature did not create objects with perfectly geometric shapes and energy signatures that fluctuated in mathematical patterns. The expedition took 6 months to reach the object using the best ships humanity had available at the time. Claire led a team of 20 scientists and engineers with military escort provided by Captain Ryan Carter, who was young then and still believed that the universe made sense if you just looked at it the right way. When they finally got close enough to see the object clearly, everyone on the ship fell silent because words seemed inadequate to describe what floated before them. The vessel was over 60 kilometers long, with a hull that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating an effect where the ship looked like a hole in space itself. The design was elegant in a way that suggested its creators had long ago mastered the balance between form and function. There were no visible weapons, but something about the ship's structure made it clear that this was a warship, built by beings who understood violence on a scale humanity had never imagined. Scans showed that the ship was old beyond measure, easily millions of years based on the radiation signatures and the wear patterns on its hull. Claire and her team spent weeks just mapping the exterior before they found an entrance that responded to their presence. The airlock cycled open with mechanisms that still worked after eons of drift, and the interior was preserved in a way that seemed impossible. There were no bodies and no signs of what had happened to the crew. Everything was simply abandoned, as if one day the inhabitants had decided to leave and never come back. Paul Dixon, the chief engineer, began documenting every system he could find with an enthusiasm that bordered on obsession. The ship's power core was still active, running on principles that made Earth's best reactors look like children's toys. The engines could theoretically accelerate the vessel to speeds that would tear apart any human-made ship. The weapon systems were integrated into the hull in ways that suggested the entire ship was designed as a single, massive weapon platform. They found data storage systems that took months to crack, and even then, only revealed fragments of information. The species that built this ship called themselves the Architects, and they had ruled the galaxy during an era when most current species were still evolving from simple organisms. Their technology was so advanced that the Valorians and their contemporaries would have been like Stone Age tribes trying to understand modern computing. But something had happened to the Architects, something that made them disappear completely from the galaxy without leaving any survivors or colonies behind. Earth's government faced a decision that would define humanity's future. They could announce the discovery and share it with the galactic community, which would likely result in the ship being claimed by the Council or fought over by various empires. Or they could keep it secret and attempt to restore it themselves, which would require resources on a scale that would strain Earth's economy and require absolute secrecy for decades. President Helen Cross, who was just a senator back then, argued passionately for the second option because she believed that humanity needed an advantage in a galaxy that had already shown itself to be hostile to newcomers. The project consumed resources that officially went to other programs through a web of classified budgets and hidden allocations. Thousands of scientists and engineers were recruited with security clearances that made them disappear from public life. Construction began on a hidden facility on Europa, Jupiter's moon, where the ship would be towed for restoration work. The official story was that Europa Station was a research facility studying the moon's subsurface ocean, which was technically true, but left out the part about the ancient warship hidden beneath the ice. Paul Dixon led the engineering effort with Claire providing research on architect technology. They made slow progress because every system they tried to understand revealed 10 more that they did not. The ship's AI, which Claire nicknamed Oracle, was still partially functional, but communicated in ways that human minds struggled to interpret. It took years just to establish basic protocols for making the AI respond to commands. Ryan Carter was chosen to command the vessel after his exemplary service record and psychological evaluations suggested he could handle the pressure. He was promoted to captain and given access to information that made him question everything he thought he knew about humanity's place in the galaxy. His orders were simple, in theory, but impossible in practice. Learn to operate an alien warship built by a species millions of years more advanced, and be ready to use it if humanity's survival ever depended on it. The crew of 3,000 was selected from volunteers who understood they were saying goodbye to their old lives. They moved to Europa Station and began training in simulators while the restoration work continued around them. Many of them would never see Earth again. Some died in accidents, when systems failed unexpectedly. Others went mad from the isolation and the pressure of keeping secrets that felt too heavy to carry. The weapon systems nearly killed half the crew during the first live fire test. They activated what they thought was a point defense system and instead triggered something that created a gravitational distortion strong enough to crush a small moon. The blast was directed away from Europa, but the incident made everyone realize how dangerous the Vanguard truly was. They were children playing with a loaded gun that could destroy solar systems. Years passed with setbacks and breakthroughs coming in unpredictable waves. Oracle slowly began cooperating more as the crew learned to interface with it properly. The AI revealed that the architects had built hundreds of ships like this one, each one capable of destroying entire fleets single-handedly. But the architects were gone, and their ships had been scattered across the galaxy, drifting in the void until someone found them. Ryan struggled with the weight of command in ways he had not anticipated. He was responsible for a weapon that could change the balance of power in the galaxy, or accidentally destroy Earth if something went wrong. He trained his crew relentlessly because he knew that if the day ever came when they needed the Vanguard, there would be no time for mistakes. He also knew that using this ship would make humanity a target for every species that feared what they did not understand. Claire continued studying architect ruins that were discovered on various worlds humanity had settled. She found warnings in their data, fragments of information about something that had frightened even them. The architects had been preparing for a threat and building ships like the Vanguard in response to it. Whatever they had feared, it was powerful enough to wipe out a civilization that had mastered technology beyond current galactic understanding. The project cost more than anyone wanted to admit and required lies upon lies to maintain secrecy. Entire departments of Earth's government existed solely to create false trails and hide the truth. Families were told their loved ones were working on classified projects in distant systems. The resources poured into the Vanguard meant that other programs went underfunded and other needs went unmet. But slowly, steadily, the Vanguard came back to life. Systems that had been dormant for millions of years began functioning again under human direction. The crew learned to operate weapons they could barely comprehend and navigate using star charts that showed constellations long since changed by stellar drift. Paul Dixon estimated they had restored about 60% of the ship's original capabilities, which was still more than enough to make it the most powerful vessel in known space. When Admiral Greg Hayes received word that the Valorian Armada was assembling, he immediately contacted Europa Station with a priority alert. Ryan received the orders while standing on the observation deck watching Jupiter's massive storms swirl across the planet's surface. His first officer, Commander Lucas Price, stood beside him looking equally grim. The moment they had trained for had arrived, and neither of them felt ready, despite 2 decades of preparation. Ryan addressed his crew over the ship's communication system with words that had been carefully prepared but felt inadequate now that he spoke them. For 20 years, they had worked in secret, sacrificing normal lives for a mission they hoped would never be necessary. Now, they would take the Vanguard into battle against an enemy that outnumbered them thousands to one. They were not heroes because heroes fought for glory, and they were fighting simply because there was no one else who could. The crew responded with grim determination because they knew what failure meant. If the Vanguard could not stop the Valorian fleet, humanity would be exterminated. Every person they loved, every place they remembered, would be destroyed. Admiral Hayes sent the final authorization codes, and Ryan input them into the command console. Oracle responded with a sound like distant music mixed with whale song, confirming that all systems were ready for departure. The Vanguard detached from Europa Station and began moving toward the outer solar system. Its stealth systems, which humanity had finally learned to operate properly, made it invisible to every sensor technology currently used by galactic civilizations. They would position themselves beyond Neptune's orbit and wait for the perfect moment to reveal themselves. Ryan sat in his command chair, surrounded by displays showing tactical data and crew status reports. He felt the weight of 3,000 lives depending on his decisions and the survival of humanity resting on whether they had learned enough about architect technology to actually use it effectively in combat. The Valorian Armada dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of human space, with a display of force designed to inspire terror and hopelessness. Over 10,000 ships materialized in formations that had been perfected over centuries of conquest. Each vessel was a masterpiece of military engineering, with weapons capable of reducing planets to molten slag and shields that could withstand sustained bombardment from lesser fleets. War Master Thexnal stood on the bridge of his flagship, surveying the tactical displays with the satisfaction of a predator that had cornered its prey. He broadcast his ultimatum across all frequencies, using translation protocols that would ensure every human in the solar system heard his words. Humanity had 12 hours to surrender unconditionally and accept whatever fate the Valorian Empire deemed appropriate. Resistance would be met with total annihilation. Cooperation would result in enslavement, but at least survival. The choice seemed obvious to Thexnal, because in his experience, inferior species always chose survival over dignity. Vice Admiral Kate Morrison commanded Earth's defense fleet from her flagship stationed near Mars. She was a career officer who had fought pirates and rebels but never faced anything close to the armada that now threatened her home. Her 200 ships represented humanity's entire space-based military force, built over 3 decades of rapid expansion and constant resource shortages. They were good ships with well-trained crews, but looking at the tactical displays showing the Valorian numbers made her feel like she was preparing to fight a hurricane with a handful of umbrellas. She opened a channel to all ships under her command and spoke with a calm she did not feel. They all knew the odds, and they all understood that survival was unlikely, but they were here because someone had to stand between Earth and annihilation, because surrender meant the end of everything humanity hoped to become. If they were going to die, they would die making the Valorians pay for every inch of space, for every second of time, for every human life they tried to extinguish. The countdown began, and Kate could feel the tension radiating through her crew as they prepared for battle. Engineers checked weapons systems for the 1,000th time. Tactical officers reviewed attack patterns that would likely become meaningless once the fighting started. Medical teams prepared for casualties they knew would overwhelm their facilities. Kate thought about her family on Earth and hoped they would remember her as someone who did not run when things became impossible. Beyond Neptune's orbit, hidden in the darkness of deep space, where even starlight seemed reluctant to penetrate, the Vanguard waited with all systems powered down to minimum levels. Ryan sat in his command chair watching the countdown with the kind of focus that came from knowing everything depended on precise timing. His crew was ready. As ready as they could be, given that they were about to use technology they had only partially mastered against an enemy that had never known defeat. Commander Lucas Price stood at his station monitoring sensor data that showed the Valorian fleet beginning its advance toward the inner solar system. The formation was textbook perfect, with heavy assault ships in the front, support vessels in the middle, and carriers in the rear. They moved with the confidence of a force that had crushed 17 rebellions and never lost a major engagement. Lucas wondered if they had any idea what was waiting for them, or if their arrogance would only make the surprise more devastating. With 3 hours remaining before the deadline, the Valorian fleet crossed the orbit of Jupiter and began accelerating toward Mars, where Kate's fleet waited. Thexnal opened communications again, demanding immediate surrender and mocking humanity's pitiful defensive formation. Kate responded by ordering her fleet to open fire, even though they were at extreme range and unlikely to do significant damage. The gesture was symbolic, but it mattered because symbols were sometimes all that separated civilization from barbarism. Human missiles and energy weapons reached across the void and began impacting Valorian shields. The attacks did minimal damage, but they announced that humanity would not go quietly into extinction. The Valorian response was overwhelming and methodical. Return fire began cutting through human ships with surgical precision. Shields collapsed, hulls ruptured, and crew compartments vented into space. Within minutes, Kate had lost 30 ships with minimal effect on the enemy formation. She ordered tactical withdrawals and hit-and-run attacks. Anything to slow the advance and buy more time. Her ships darted between asteroids and used every trick they knew. But the Valorians adapted quickly. More human vessels exploded in brilliant flashes that lit up the darkness. The crews died professionally, maintaining formation and discipline until the end. Kate felt each loss like a physical blow, but kept her voice steady as she issued orders that everyone knew were only delaying the inevitable. Thexanol laughed as he watched the human resistance crumble. This was going even easier than he had predicted. The humans had spirit, but spirit meant nothing against superior firepower. He ordered his fleet to maintain the advance and prepare for orbital bombardment once they reached Earth. The Council wanted this over quickly, and he was happy to oblige. On the Vanguard, Ryan watched the battle unfold through sensors that could see details the combatants themselves could not. He saw human ships dying and felt the weight of every life lost. His crew was silent, waiting for the order that would change everything. The plan required precise timing because they needed the Valorian fleet to be fully committed, too deep into human space to retreat quickly, confident enough that surprise would have maximum impact. With minutes remaining before Earth's orbital defense platforms would be in range of Valorian weapons, Ryan gave the orders he had rehearsed for 20 years. All systems were to activate simultaneously, from weapons to shields, to the stealth field that had kept them hidden. Oracle responded with harmonics that vibrated through the ship's structure as ancient technology came to full power for the first time in millions of years. Lieutenant Sam Hughes, at the tactical station, confirmed that all weapons were online and tracking algorithms were active. Lieutenant Megan Foster at the weapons control reported that firing solutions were locked for over 3,000 targets. The main guns, which humanity had only test-fired twice in controlled conditions, showed ready status with energy readings that made the displays flicker. Ryan opened a channel to Admiral Greg Hayes on Earth and received final authorization. This was it. The moment when humanity revealed what they had hidden for 2 decades. He took a breath and gave the command that would echo through galactic history, decloak and show them what they are facing. Reality seemed to tear apart in the void beyond Neptune as the Vanguard dropped its stealth field and became visible. The ship materialized like a nightmare taking physical form. 60 kilometers of midnight black hull, bristling with weapons that crackled with barely contained energy. The architect design was beautiful and terrible, curves and angles that suggested both elegance and lethal purpose. Power readings emanated from the vessel in waves that set off every sensor alarm in the Valorian fleet. On his flagship, Thexnal felt something he had not experienced in decades of warfare. Fear, raw and primal. The kind that made his scales stand rigid and his breathing become rapid. The tactical displays were showing impossible readings, energy signatures that exceeded anything in the current galactic database by orders of magnitude. His weapons officers reported that their targeting systems could not establish a lock because the ship's energy field was interfering with their sensors. The entire Valorian fleet halted its advance as 10,000 commanders tried to understand what they were seeing. Communications, channels filled with confusion and alarm. Some ships began charging weapons, while others requested orders from their chain of command. The perfect formation that had advanced with such confidence now wavered like a living thing that had suddenly encountered something beyond its understanding. Ryan's voice broadcast across all frequencies with calm authority that made his words more frightening than any threat. He identified himself as the captain of the USS Vanguard and explained that the Valorians had made a critical mistake. They had come to exterminate humanity without doing proper research. They had assumed that a young species would be helpless against a galactic empire. They were wrong. He gave them one chance to leave and never return. If they chose to fight, they would discover why the architects had ruled the galaxy unopposed for millions of years. The Vanguard's weapons were online and locked. The choice was theirs, but they should choose quickly, because his patience was limited. On the council station at Apex Prime, Zexthor and the other representatives watched the situation unfold through real-time data feeds. The chamber had fallen silent, except for the sound of translation systems, struggling to keep up with multiple species, expressing shock simultaneously. Every scan of the human vessel showed technology that should not exist, power levels that defied their understanding of physics. Some representatives began calling for immediate negotiations. Others demanded to know how humanity had acquired such a ship. Zexthor simply stared at the displays and wondered what other secrets humanity had kept hidden. Thexnal felt the eyes of the entire galaxy watching him and knew that retreating now would destroy his reputation and the Valorian Empire's position as the Council's primary military force. His pride warred with his survival instincts, while his tactical officers waited for orders that would determine whether they lived or died. He had spent his entire life building a reputation as a commander who never backed down from any challenge, and the thought of running from a single enemy vessel, no matter how powerful it appeared, felt like death itself. He opened a channel to his fleet and issued orders that his second-in-command immediately questioned, but would not dare override. The Armada would attack with full force, concentrating fire on the human vessel until it was destroyed. It was one ship against 10,000, and Thexnal convinced himself that overwhelming numbers would prevail regardless of technological advantages. He had fought long enough to know that battles were won by courage and determination as much as by superior weapons. The Valorian fleet reorganized into attack formation with heavy dreadnoughts moving forward to absorb the first strikes while missile frigates prepared coordinated salvos. 3,000 ships aligned their targeting systems on the vanguard and fired simultaneously in a display of force that had shattered planetary defense grids on a dozen worlds. Missiles by the tens of thousands streaked toward the human vessel, trailing plasma and fury. On the vanguard, Lieutenant Megan Foster activated the point defense systems without waiting for orders because the timing was too critical for human reaction speeds. Oracle took over targeting with calculations that occurred faster than thought. The space around the vanguard erupted with directed energy beams that moved like fingers of light, touching each incoming missile with precision that seemed almost gentle. The weapons did not explode in the traditional sense. They simply ceased to exist as if they had been erased from reality by something that did not tolerate their presence. Thexnal watched thousands of missiles vanish before reaching their target and felt his certainty crumble. The human ship had not even moved or activated shields. It had simply made his weapons disappear. He ordered the dreadnoughts to fire their main batteries, massive energy cannons that required minutes to charge but could punch through any known shield system. 20 dreadnoughts fired in unison, beams of concentrated energy that could melt moons converging on a single point. Ryan gave the order to return fire with main weapons only. Megan targeted 3 of the dreadnoughts that were closest to Earth and activated firing sequences that made the Vanguard's hull vibrate with barely contained power. The main guns, which Dr. Lisa Bennett had theorized were gravitational disruptors based on architect data fragments, fired with a sound that seemed wrong, a note that made human ears ring and stomachs twist. The effect was visible to every sensor in the solar system. 3 Valorian dreadnoughts, each one over 5 kilometers long and carrying enough firepower to level continents, began collapsing inward. Their shields might as well have been tissue paper against weapons that manipulated gravity itself. The massive vessels crumpled like aluminum cans under pressure, metal shrieking and energy cores rupturing as they were compressed into spheres barely 50 meters across. The entire process took less than 5 seconds from firing to complete destruction. Panic spread through the Valorian ranks like fire through dry grass. Commanders who had never known defeat suddenly found themselves facing an enemy they could not comprehend. Ships began breaking formation as captains made individual decisions to either flee or fight. Some vessels tried to fall back, while others pushed forward in desperate attacks. The perfect military machine that had entered human space with such confidence was coming apart as fear overrode discipline and training. Ryan watched the chaos on his tactical displays and felt no satisfaction. This was not a battle in any traditional sense. It was a massacre, and the fact that the Valorians had started it did not make the killing easier to accept. But he had responsibilities that went beyond his personal feelings. Humanity's survival depended on making the galaxy understand that attacking Earth came with a price too high for anyone to pay. He ordered secondary batteries to engage, and Megan complied with mechanical efficiency. Lance beams of purple energy shot out from the Vanguard's hull, each one precise and devastating. The beams did not need to hit critical systems or find weak points. They simply cut through Valorian ships like a knife through fog, severing vessels in half with cuts so clean that the separated sections continued drifting in formation for several seconds before internal explosions tore them apart. Vexnal's flagship rocked from near misses as the battle turned into a rout. His tactical officer reported losses exceeding 1,000 ships, with no measurable damage to the enemy vessel. The human ship was not even pursuing. It sat in space like a predator that did not need to chase its prey because the prey could not escape. Communication channels filled with distress calls and requests for retreat orders that Thexnal could not bring himself to give because acknowledging defeat meant accepting that everything he believed about Valorian superiority was a lie. Kate Morrison and her surviving fleet watched from their position near Mars as the Valorian armada disintegrated. Ships fled in every direction, trying to escape the Vanguard's weapons range. The human crews cheered at first, but the celebration died quickly as they realized what they were witnessing. The enemy was being slaughtered, without mercy or hesitation. Kate felt relief at survival mixed with horror at the scale of destruction. The battle, if it could be called that, lasted 37 minutes from first shot to final retreat order. The Valorian Empire lost over 1,200 ships, completely destroyed, and another 800 damaged, badly enough to require months of repair. Human casualties from the earlier fighting totaled 43 ships. The Vanguard suffered no damage whatsoever, because nothing the Valorians fired had even managed to reach its hull. Thexenel finally gave the order to retreat, abandoning his flagship in a small shuttle because the main ship was too damaged to make the jump to faster than light speed. He watched his fleet scatter like prey animals fleeing a predator, and knew that his career was over. The mighty armada that had come to exterminate humanity was running away from a single enemy vessel. History would remember this day, and his name would become synonymous with failure. Ryan opened a channel to the Galactic Council that he knew would be monitored by representatives from every major civilization. His words were chosen carefully because this message would define how the galaxy perceived humanity for generations to come. He explained that humanity had not wanted this war, that they had asked only for fair treatment and basic rights. The Council had responded with threats of genocide and sent an armada to enforce their will. Now, the galaxy knew the truth, and that truth was simple. Humanity had teeth and claws, and the will to use them. The Vanguard was not just a ship, it was a promise that humanity would never again face extinction helplessly. Any species that came to human space with hostile intent would meet the same fate as the Valorian fleet. Humanity did not seek to conquer or rule, but they would defend themselves with whatever means necessary. On Apex Prime, Zexthor and the Council representatives sat in stunned silence as casualty reports continued streaming in. The chamber that had been so confident in authorizing the Valorian attack now felt like a funeral home. Representatives, who had spoken loudly about teaching humanity their place, were now very quiet. Some species were already sending diplomatic channels requesting meetings to discuss peaceful relations. Others simply stared at the displays showing the Vanguard's power and tried to calculate how this changed every strategic consideration they had made about galactic politics. President Helen Cross received the battle reports in the Situation Room surrounded by her cabinet and military advisors. The relief was overwhelming, but she could see in their faces the same concern she felt. They had won this confrontation, but at what cost? Humanity had revealed themselves as a power that could not be ignored or underestimated. That would bring new challenges and new enemies who saw them as a threat rather than victims. She opened a channel to Ryan on the Vanguard and asked for his assessment. Ryan looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. He told her that the Valorians would not return soon, that the galaxy was afraid of humanity now, that they had achieved their goal of security through strength. But he also warned that fear was a temporary deterrent. Eventually, fear would turn to anger and resentment. Other species would start asking how humanity had acquired such advanced technology. They would form alliances based on mutual concern about the human threat. The Vanguard had saved them today, but it also painted a target on Earth that would never completely fade. Kate Morrison and her surviving fleet received orders to return to Mars and begin recovery operations. She had lost crew and friends in the fighting, and now faced the task of writing letters to families, explaining why their loved ones had died. As she composed the first message, she wondered if those deaths had meaning, or if humanity had simply traded one kind of danger for another. The galaxy would never see them as weak again, but strength came with its own burdens that no one had fully considered until now. 6 months after what every news service in the galaxy called the Neptune engagement, the political landscape had transformed in ways that no one had fully predicted. The Galactic Council met in emergency sessions weekly, trying to address the sudden shift in power dynamics. Some species demanded that humanity be given full membership with all rights and privileges. Others argued that humanity should be isolated and monitored closely. A few brave or foolish representatives still called for military action. Though these voices became quieter each time someone reminded them what happened to the last fleet that threatened Earth. Jake Sullivan returned to the council chambers, but this time he walked in as Earth's official ambassador with full diplomatic status. The platform where he had stood alone facing hostility now had a designated section for human representatives, complete with comfortable seating and translation equipment, calibrated to human speech patterns. The change was symbolic, but symbols mattered in galactic politics. He negotiated trade agreements, colonial rights, and security arrangements from a position of strength that felt surreal given how recently humanity had faced extinction. The negotiations were complex because fear made species either overly accommodating or stubbornly resistant. Some wanted favorable trade deals, hoping to gain human friendship, or at least avoid human hostility. Others refused to acknowledge humanity's new status out of pride or anger. Jake navigated these dynamics with patience and a willingness to compromise on small matters while remaining firm on core issues. Humanity gained protected trade routes, formal recognition of their colonies, and a seat on the Council's Security Committee that oversaw military matters. But success came with complications that became apparent during a closed session, where Jake met privately with Zex Thor. The council leader spoke carefully about concerns that many species shared but would not voice publicly. Humanity had revealed technology far beyond anything the current galactic civilization possessed. The question everyone asked was where had it come from, and did humanity have more surprises hidden away? Zex Thor was diplomatic, but his meaning was clear. Trust required transparency, and right now humanity seemed like a species keeping dangerous secrets. Jake had been authorized to reveal partial truth as part of a carefully planned information release. He explained that humanity had discovered an ancient derelict vessel and spent 20 years restoring it. The ship belonged to a species called the Architects, who had vanished millions of years ago. What he did not mention was how much they truly understood about the technology or whether more architect vessels existed. That information remained classified because ambiguity served humanity's security interests better than complete honesty. The partial revelation created new controversies. Archaeological teams from dozens species requested permission to study architect sites in human space. Military analysts wanted detailed information about the Vanguard's capabilities. Scientists argued that such important discoveries should be shared with the galactic community. Jake deflected these requests with polite firmness while humanity's government decided how much to reveal and when. President Helen Cross announced the existence of 3 more vessels similar to the Vanguard during a speech that was broadcast across human space and transmitted to the Galactic Council. She described them as part of Earth's defensive network, each one capable of protecting human colonies and trade routes. The announcement was a calculated bluff, because only the Vanguard was truly functional. The other 3 ships existed but were years away from operational status. Still, the lie worked because no one dared to call it. The mere possibility that humanity had 4 superweapons changed every strategic calculation. On Earth, the public reaction to recent events was divided in ways that reflected deeper conflicts about humanity's direction. Massive protests erupted in major cities, with demonstrators carrying signs that read things like, "We became the monsters," and "Peace, not power." Senator Philip Grant became the voice of opposition, arguing that humanity had betrayed its values by using intimidation and overwhelming force. He gave speeches warning that the path they had chosen would lead to militarism and eventually tyranny as power corrupted those who wielded it. President Cross addressed these concerns in a speech that historians would later cite as defining humanity's position in the galaxy. She spoke from the presidential residence with Earth visible through the window behind her. She acknowledged the protesters' concerns and agreed that using overwhelming force was not something to celebrate. But she also explained the reality they faced. The galaxy had answered humanity's peaceful requests with threats of genocide. The Vanguard was not a weapon of conquest but a deterrent, ensuring that humanity would never again face extinction helplessly. She spoke about the difference between having power and abusing it, about the responsibility that came with strength, about the need to remain vigilant without becoming the aggressors they feared. Humanity did not seek to rule the galaxy or impose its will on other species. They wanted only to live free and pursue their own destiny without permission from others. The Vanguard existed to guarantee that freedom, nothing more and nothing less. Ryan Carter received promotion to Admiral and took command of a new division overseeing Earth's architect-based defense systems. The promotion came with an office and staff, but he spent most of his time on the Vanguard because the ship felt more like home than anywhere else. He oversaw training for crews assigned to the other vessels, sharing everything they had learned about operating technology they barely understood. The weight of command had not lessened with victory. If anything, it had grown heavier because now everyone looked to him as an expert on matters he still felt uncertain about. He met regularly with Claire Morgan, who continued studying architect ruins with increased urgency. She had made a discovery that kept her awake at night, and finally she felt she had enough evidence to bring it to Admiral Greg Hayes. They met in a secure facility, where Claire presented her findings with visible anxiety. The architects had not simply vanished. They had been destroyed by something, wiped out by a threat so severe that even their advanced technology could not save them. The data fragments she had translated told a story of increasing desperation, of the architects building more ships and developing more powerful weapons in response to an enemy they called the Harvesters. The fragments described battles on scales that made the Neptune engagement look like a minor skirmish. Entire star systems had been evacuated, whole sectors of space had been abandoned, and eventually, the architects had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only ruins and abandoned vessels like the Vanguard. Claire's hands shook as she explained the implications. Whatever killed the architects might still be out there, dormant or waiting, or simply taking its time to return. And if those entities detected humanity using architect technology, they might interpret it as a reason to investigate, or worse, to see humanity as the architect's successors and therefore legitimate targets. Admiral Hayes listened with growing concern and asked the obvious question. Should they stop using the Vanguard and risk being vulnerable to galactic threats, or continue using it and risk attracting something far more dangerous? Claire had no answer because there was no good answer. They were trapped between known threats from the galactic community and unknown threats from whatever had destroyed the architects. She recommended increased research into architect history and expanded monitoring of deep space for any unusual activity. Hayes agreed and authorized additional resources while classifying the information at levels that meant only a handful of people would know about the potential danger. Jake faced challenges in his diplomatic role that went beyond formal negotiations. Several species had begun forming quiet alliances based on mutual concern about humanity's rapid rise to power. Intelligence reports suggested that the Valorian Empire was rebuilding its fleet with new designs intended to counter architect technology. Other civilizations were increasing military spending and conducting joint exercises. The galaxy was not preparing for immediate war, but it was clearly preparing for the possibility. He met with representatives from moderate species who wanted peaceful relations, but also wanted reassurance that humanity would not use its power to dominate others. These conversations required delicate balancing between appearing strong enough to deter aggression, but not so aggressive that they seemed like the next threat to galactic stability. Jake spent hours in meetings explaining humanity's intentions, negotiating agreements, and building relationships that might prevent future conflicts. Ryan stood on the Vanguard's observation deck, watching Earth rotate peacefully below, and thinking about the path that had brought him here. 20 years of training, 37 minutes of combat, and now, a lifetime of consequences to manage. Commander Lucas Price joined him with 2 cups of coffee, and they stood in comfortable silence before Lucas asked the question that Ryan had been asking himself. Did they make the right choice using the Vanguard, or had they opened a door that should have stayed closed? Ryan considered his answer carefully because honest uncertainty felt more appropriate than false confidence. They had survived, and that was not nothing. Humanity was no longer helpless prey for any galactic empire that decided they were inconvenient. But survival came with costs that would take generations to fully understand. They had revealed themselves as a power that others would always watch with suspicion. They had used technology they did not fully comprehend against an enemy that would not forget the humiliation. And somewhere in the darkness beyond known space, something ancient might have taken notice. He told Lucas that history would judge their actions, and they would have to live with that judgment. But given the choice between certain death and uncertain survival, he would make the same decision again. The alternative was extinction, and nothing justified accepting that fate without fighting. Whether that made them heroes or fools would depend on what happened next, far beyond the edge of known space, In the darkness between galaxies, where stars were distant pinpoints and civilizations were impossible, something stirred. Ancient sensors that had been dormant for millions of years detected energy signatures they were programmed to recognize. Architect technology was active again, being used by species that had not existed the last time these sensors had reported data. Massive structures older than most stars began powering up with processes that would take years to complete. The harvesters were not a species in any conventional sense. They were something else. Something that had ended the architects and then returned to sleep. They did not think in ways organic minds could comprehend, and they did not have purposes that translated to normal motivations. They simply existed and responded to specific conditions. One of those conditions was the use of architect technology by non-architects. Deep space monitoring stations at the edge of human territory began detecting anomalies that their operators could not explain. Strange energy fluctuations that appeared and disappeared, gravitational distortions with no apparent source, and radio signals in frequencies that no known civilization used. The reports were filed and investigated but found no clear explanations. Most were classified as equipment malfunctions or natural phenomena. Claire Morgan saw the reports during her routine review of scientific data and felt ice form in her stomach. The patterns matched fragments she had found in architect records, warnings about signs that preceded harvester activity. She immediately contacted Admiral Hayes and requested an emergency meeting. The evidence was preliminary and possibly coincidental, but if she was right, humanity's survival of the Valorian threat might turn out to be the least of their problems. On Earth, life continued with normal routines as people went to work, raised families, and pursued dreams without knowing about the potential danger lurking in the darkness. The Vanguard patrolled human space as a silent guardian, visible reminder of humanity's power, and symbol of their determination to survive. Ryan commanded his ship and trained his crews and tried not to think too much about ancient warnings and strange signals from empty space. The galaxy had changed and humanity's place in it was secure for now. They had proven they could defend themselves and earned respect through strength, if not friendship. But the universe was vast and old and full of mysteries that civilizations barely beginning to explore space could not fully comprehend. Humanity had survived one existential threat only to discover that the galaxy held dangers far greater than empires and councils and political disputes. The story of humanity's rise from threatened species to galactic power was written, but the story of what came next was just beginning. Whether they would survive what the architects could not remained to be seen. For now, they watched the stars, maintained their ships, and hoped that the silence from deep space meant safety rather than the calm before a storm that would make the Valorian armada seem like a minor inconvenience.